Giovanni di Bicci de Medici was not born to rule Florence. In fact, he wasn't even born to lead its finances. When he entered the world in 1360, the Medici name held only minor recognition, an old Florentine lineage, yes, but one with no grand titles, no landed estates, and certainly no claim to the political centers of power. His father Averardo had modest financial standing, and while the family boasted noble ancestry, it had long since fallen into relative obscurity. Yet in an age when nobility was bleeding cash and merchants were rising like kings, Giovanni understood that quiet reinvention, not loud assertion, would become the key to power. Florence in the late 14th century was a republic in name only. Power rotated among a narrow elite of wealthy families, bankers, merchants, and guildmasters who formed temporary alliances to dominate the signoria, the city's ruling council. In this turbulent structure, Giovanni found opportunity. He studied the faults of these ruling families, noting how flamboyance bred envy and how direct political engagement made men vulnerable. His early years were spent in Rome, not Florence, a strategic distance. There, he worked as a junior clerk for the powerful banking firm of the Vieri di Cambio, gaining first-hand experience with the delicate art of papal finance. It was in Rome that Giovanni began to internalize his cardinal rule influence must be invisible. When the Vieri Bank collapsed, Giovanni saw not disaster but a vacuum. Using personal connections and a quiet loan from family wealth, he founded the Medici Bank in 1397. It was not the largest bank in Florence, but it was the best concealed. Instead of operating with flashy branches or public grandeur, Giovanni focused on a decentralized structure, local agents, discreet partners, and above all, direct lines of credit to powerful men who owed him silence more than loyalty. He made his fortune quietly and rarely signed his own name on controversial deals. Giovanni's marriage to Piccarda Bueri, daughter of a wealthy merchant family, consolidated his entry into the inner merchant elite. But again, he avoided overt entanglement with politics. While the Albizzi and Strassi families clashed publicly in the Signoria, Giovanni funded civic works hospitals and cathedrals, becoming a man of the people without ever claiming the title. He understood Florence's deepest flaw. Its leaders were always hated for being seen as leaders. Giovanni then would be their benefactor instead. Behind this modest image, however, lay a systematic expansion of influence. The Medici Bank became the de facto financial engine of the Papal States. When Pope John I, an exile in need of backing, turned to Florence for support, it was Giovanni who funded his campaign and in return secured lucrative papal banking rights. This meant that every indulgence sold, every tithe collected, every crusade fund distributed in Christendom passed in some way through Medici hands. Yet Giovanni never flaunted this. He allowed others to wear the power. He held the purse. There was something almost clinical in Giovanni's detachment from overt politics. In 1421, when offered a seat in the Signoria, he accepted with visible reluctance and refused any long-term engagement. He turned down roles that would have made him more prominent in the eyes of the public. To many Florentines, this was humility. To others, it was calculation. Indeed, Giovanni's calculated aloofness masked a growing web of control. He funded both sides of guild conflicts, provided quiet loans to rival families, and then subtly enforced repayment schedules that favored his preferred outcomes. Most unsettling to his critics was his handling of the tax system. In 1426, when Florence faced bankruptcy after years of war, Giovanni proposed the catasto, a property tax reform based on wealth, not status. Aristocrats were outraged, but the people loved it. The oligarchs saw an insidious move, a banker weaponizing populism to break their centuries-old immunity from taxation. This political gamble painted a target on his back, yet Giovanni remained untouched. That he managed to pass this reform without becoming its public champion was telling. He had mastered the ancient Roman art of ruling by proxy, yet even the most careful strategist cannot avoid resentment. Among Florence's elite, whispers began to circulate. Was Giovanni simply a lucky banker, or was he reshaping the republic under the illusion of benevolence? One senator is recorded in a private letter as saying he acts like a servant but lives like a king. Perhaps most revealing is a lesser-known episode from 1427. An anonymous pamphlet circulated accusing an unnamed banker of using foreign influence to manipulate the Florentine treasury. The document was crude, but its implications were sharp. While no name was printed, the pamphlet ended with a Latin phrase, "Cujus crumina regit ecclesiam," whose purse governs the church. It was a phrase that would haunt Giovanni's final years. Adding to the tension were subtle shifts in Giovanni's personal behavior. Servants reportedly noted his increasing withdrawal from public banquets and a preference for private meetings in small candlelit rooms, meetings that often included physicians and legal scribes. One curious detail survives in the diary of a junior banker named Matteo della Torre, who wrote, "Signore Giovanni has ordered the cellar sealed from all but one man." He says the wine is now a matter of family security. Whether it was paranoia or prescience, Giovanni sensed that his empire built on trust illusion and silence was approaching a moment of transition. Banking in early 15th century Italy was not merely a profession, it was a form of power that rivaled thrones. For Giovanni di Bicci de Medici, this power was best exercised from behind a curtain. While the Medici Bank expanded across Florence, Rome, Geneva, Venice, and even into Bruges, Giovanni actively avoided the image of a traditional banker lord. He wore plain robes, he refused extravagant titles. Yet beneath the humble presentation lay a carefully structured financial empire that reached into the very core of Christendom. Giovanni's defining maneuver was embedding his bank within the sacred infrastructure of the Catholic Church. His relationship with Pope John XXIII, formerly Baldassare Casa, was particularly emblematic. John had been one of 3 competing popes during the chaotic Western Schism, and he owed his temporary legitimacy to Florentine, backing primarily Giovanni's. In exchange, the Medici Bank was granted control over the apostolic chamber, allowing it to manage indulgence revenues, papal taxes, and diplomatic transfers. For Giovanni, this meant more than money. It meant data leverage and the ability to squeeze a bishop in Cologne or forgive the debts of a French cardinal with a single pen stroke. And yet the Medici name remained curiously absent from most papal records of the time. Giovanni used a system of agents men loyal not to Florence, but to the family alone who signed the contracts, attended the synods, and handled the cash. This decentralization served a dual purpose. It concealed the scope of Medici power, and it protected the core family from any reputational fallout. This approach unnerved Giovanni's rivals in Florence. The Strozzi and Albizzi families, both dominant players in civic government and trade, began to question the long-term impact of such financial secrecy. Giovanni was not just gaining wealth, he was reshaping the terms of economic sovereignty in Florence. In a city built on guild traditions and mutual accountability, the idea of a single banking house operating through untraceable proxies threatened the balance of oligarchic control. But what made Giovanni especially dangerous to them was his uncanny restraint. He could have with little effort converted his wealth into a visible political machine. Instead, he chose to finance others, especially those discontented with the ruling elite. He offered loans to minor guilds to challenge major ones. He bailed out failing workshops in exchange for loyalty oaths. He backed artists, architects, and theologians who subtly questioned the moral legitimacy of inherited privilege. One particularly illustrative case was Giovanni's support for Filippo Brunelleschi's Dome project in 1420. While publicly framed as a gift to Florence, the financing also served as a quiet rebuke to established builders and old money patrons who opposed the radical engineering plans. When the Dome rose, so too did the notion that the Medici were the true visionaries of the Republic, not by decree but by investment. Florence's traditionalists attempted to retaliate through financial channels. In 1424, a coalition of rival bankers tried to undercut the Medici by flooding the local market with favorable lending terms, hoping to force Giovanni's hand. But he responded with elegant brutality. Instead of matching their rates, he simply recalled key debts owed by their most prominent allies, forcing fire sales of assets and triggering a small-scale liquidity panic. It was a masterclass in indirect warfare. Yet not all of Giovanni's strategies were so bloodless. Behind the walls of the Medici counting house, a different kind of control was taking root. Giovanni began collecting what modern minds would call compromise dossiers, personal ledgers recording the weaknesses, vices, and hidden affairs of his most important clients. One partial inventory, found decades later in a family archive, included such chilling entries as Bishop of Lucca, opium Roman mistress, fears exposure to niece and Ruggiero Pazzi, unpaid debt brothel involvement, suspicious death of accountant. These files were never intended for public release. They were insurance policies. Even within his own family, Giovanni exercised a quietly domineering control. His sons Cosimo and Lorenzo were trained from an early age to think not in terms of glory, but of position. Giovanni insisted that they appeared less than what they were, dressing modestly speaking rarely in public assemblies, and never publicly challenging the government, even when insulted. Perhaps the most revealing insight into Giovanni's mindset comes from an obscure legal case in 1425. A minor merchant had defaulted on a loan from a Medici affiliate. Rather than initiate standard debt recovery, Giovanni sent a scribe with a sealed letter and an empty coffer. The merchant, terrified, fled Florence the next day and was never seen again. The contents of the letter were never revealed, but the message was clear: silence and fear did more than courts and lawsuits. Still, despite his careful constructions, cracks were beginning to appear. A series of leaked transactions revealed that Giovanni had quietly financed a faction of anti-Albizzi agitators, a revelation that would destabilize the already fragile political equilibrium. While he denied involvement, Florentine whispers grew louder. These suspicions culminated in a peculiar incident in early 1428, when a Dominican friar preaching at Santa Maria Novella delivered a veiled attack against those who wash their hands with the sins of money and hide behind walls of gold. No names were mentioned, but the sermon caused a stir. The friar was reassigned weeks later, and his records vanished thereafter. And still, Giovanni kept banking. He expanded his reach into Lyon, and London began exploring transactions through agents in Constantinople and planned a branch in Naples. Every new outpost meant another pin in the map of European influence, and each was structured with deniability at its core. But what unnerved his enemies and even some allies was the growing realization that Giovanni had become more than a banker. He had created a system in which power moved invisibly without titles or seats, through ledgers, debts, and whispered threats. Florence's laws governed the Republic, but Giovanni governed its obligations. It is no coincidence that in 1428, the Albizzi faction initiated a set of reforms designed to limit banking influence over public offices. One clause inserted at the last minute stipulated that those whose fortunes depend upon papal favor shall not advise the state. It was a clear shot and a final warning. Within a year, Giovanni's health would begin to decline, but the machine he built showed no signs of slowing. By 1428, Florence had become a pressure cooker of class resentment and political anxiety, and Giovanni di Bicci found himself increasingly caught between the two. His lifelong strategy of operating from the shadows was becoming harder to sustain. His influence had grown so vast, his methods so effective, that they had begun to generate their own gravity. He was no longer a hidden power, he was the power, whether he intended to be or not. And with that power came enemies, the kind who no longer whispered in back rooms, but who plotted legislation, coordinated guild votes, and manipulated the judicial system to contain what they saw as a dangerous centralization of authority. The Albizzi, longtime rulers of Florence's Republican machine, viewed Giovanni's ascendancy as both a betrayal and a threat. For years they had tolerated his quiet success in exchange for his public neutrality. But neutrality had limits. Giovanni's support of the 1427 Catasto, a landmark tax reform that shifted the fiscal burden from the poor to the rich, had irrevocably altered the class balance of the city. Suddenly, the traditional nobility found themselves paying into a system once designed to protect their wealth. Meanwhile, Florence's middling artisans, merchants, and minor officials began to look toward the Medici not just as benefactors, but as a new kind of leader, one who operated from the purse, not the sword. To the elite, this was unacceptable, and the backlash began. The Albizzi launched a campaign of soft attrition, leveraging their hold over civic institutions to limit Medici appointments to public office. New rules were enacted to prohibit bankers from serving as Gonfaloniere, Florence's chief magistrate. Taxes were revised to increase levies on financial transactions. Even the signoria's language began to shift. Official proclamations spoke less of merchant contributions and more of civic loyalty. It was subtle but strategic, a rhetorical shift designed to paint Giovanni's wealth as foreign to Florentine ideals. Giovanni, however, refused to rise to the bait. He remained outwardly detached, declining interviews, avoiding public debates, and refusing to let his sons respond to personal attacks. But he was not passive. Behind closed doors, he orchestrated a slow, deliberate response, a long-term strategy to redistribute Florence's political field in preparation for his eventual exit. He began by supporting a new wave of guild members, tailors, dyers, and wool carters who had previously been shut out of high office. Small loans, offers of protection, and informal business contracts allowed these groups to gain a foothold in government councils. He cultivated loyalty not through patronage but through shared vulnerability. These rising men owed their new lives to Giovanni's quiet hand, and their support would outlast his. Then, in a move that shocked Florence's elite, Giovanni financed the rebuilding of several working-class quarters devastated by recent floods. Rather than go through city channels, he hired local labor, directly bypassing official permits and guild contracts. While technically legal, it was an open defiance of the city's hierarchical norms. The message was clear: the Medici could govern even if not in name. The response from the oligarchs grew more aggressive. The Albizzi faction engineered a series of judicial audits aimed at uncovering irregularities in the Medici bank's dealings with Rome. One inquiry subpoenaed internal records related to papal indulgences, a clear overreach. Giovanni complied, offering only limited documentation and citing clerical confidentiality. No charges were brought, but the intent was obvious: expose the Medici to scandal, or at least sap their resources through legal pressure. In private, the strain was taking its toll. Servants at the Medici residence on Via Larga reported that Giovanni had begun suffering from sleeplessness and persistent coughing. He grew thin and irritable. One scribe noted that the household wine had been changed 3 times in a single month, reportedly due to bitter aftertastes. Whether this was mere fussiness or evidence of a deeper paranoia remains unknown, but in 15th century Florence, suspicion of poisoning was never far from any powerful man's mind. The true sign of Giovanni's fatigue came in his treatment of his sons. For years, Cosimo and Lorenzo had operated as extensions of their father's will, never overt, always deferential. But in 1428, Giovanni began formally transferring financial authority to Cosimo, granting him operational control over the Roman and Venetian branches of the bank. He also began introducing Cosimo to senior allies in the guild system, often in quiet dinners that included no servants and no records. This gradual handover did not go unnoticed. Rivals within the Albizzi camp began referring to Cosimo as the Grey Prince, a mocking nod to his behind-the-scenes control. Rumors circulated that the Medici patriarch was planning to abdicate entirely and install his son as Florence's true master through puppet councils and indirect rule. One document from this period, a preserved letter from Rinaldo degli Albizzi to a colleague in Lucca, contains a chilling line: Giovanni breeds his sons as one breeds dogs, not for loyalty but for scent. And yet, even as political warfare escalated, Giovanni remained outwardly calm. He continued donating to religious institutions, sponsoring artists, and supporting civic festivals. He played the role of an aging benefactor while quietly repositioning the chessboard beneath Florence's feet. But not all cracks could be papered over. A deeply unsettling event in mid-1429 punctured the illusion of control. A Medici accountant, Tommaso Berlinghieri, was found hanged in a storeroom off the bank's main office. The official verdict was suicide, and a hasty burial followed. But internal records later revealed that Tommaso had recently returned from Naples, carrying critical ledgers related to the Neapolitan branch ledgers that mysteriously vanished after his death. Some suspect he was silenced, others that he had become unstable under pressure. Regardless, the episode rattled the household. Giovanni canceled meetings for a full week and was not seen in public for over a month. The tension surrounding Giovanni's final months was not purely political. It had become psychological. Friends noted an increasing fatalism in his conversations. He began referencing the Decameron, particularly the tales of misers and corrupted friars. He reportedly spent long hours staring at a fresco in San Lorenzo that depicted the Last Judgment, murmuring phrases about Libro delle Anime, the Book of Souls. But despite the fatigue, the paranoia, and the growing chorus of resentment, Giovanni still refused to relinquish full control. If anything, he appeared determined to ensure that when he did die, the consequences would be irreversible. And so, while the city around him whispered, schemed, and quietly prepared for his departure, Giovanni pressed forward with an unnerving clarity. He was laying the final stones of a structure that would survive his body, one that would make his death not a moment of closure but the beginning of something far more calculated. Giovanni di Bicci had built a kingdom without a crown. As Florence approached the final months of his life in 1429, the signs of impending succession were all around, but so were the signs of danger. What made Giovanni exceptional was not just his wealth or discretion, but his ability to execute political change under the guise of neutrality. In truth, he had already begun a quiet but deliberate restructuring of Florence's internal power. Now, in his final year, that transformation accelerated. The Catasto tax reform of 1427 had already realigned the economic power base. It empowered lower and middle-class Florentines by redistributing tax burdens from flat fees toward wealth assessments. But behind the scenes, Giovanni's true brilliance was in exploiting the process of tax assessment itself. Under his guidance, the Medici gained indirect access to precise records of family holdings, properties, and hidden assets across the city. This made the bank more than a lender, it became a surveillance system. By 1428, Giovanni had instructed Cosimo to begin classifying families, not just by wealth but by political reliability. A color-coded ledger found decades later in the Medici archives revealed groupings labeled fidati trusted, osservati watched, and sospetti suspect. Entries included names, occupations, debt levels, and even rumored alliances. This was not merely an index of clients. It was a map of Florence's future government. To ensure that his exit would not create a vacuum, Giovanni initiated a final stage of institutional infiltration. He arranged for a number of minor but strategically placed allies to assume low-level civic roles: notary clerks, supply managers, court recorders. These were not glamorous positions, but they held influence in the machinery of bureaucracy, able to stall trials, prioritize permits, or redirect city funds with subtle tweaks. These placements were secured not through bribery but through service-based lending, small conditionally forgiven loans in exchange for bureaucratic cooperation. The power of obligation was stronger than gold. Meanwhile, Cosimo quietly assembled a group of advisors and political clients who would later be known, though not for another decade, as the Medici Inner Circle. This early cadre included figures like Puccio Pucci, a minor wool merchant with an eye for numbers, and Everardo de Bardi, whose family's bankruptcy had left him loyal to anyone offering stability. They were joined by lesser-known figures from the merchant class and a handful of minor clergy. In appearance, they seemed scattered and ordinary. In function, they formed the nervous system of Giovanni's posthumous regime. The Albizzi recognized what was happening. Rinaldo degli Albizzi, head of the rival faction, made several public remarks warning of a merchant cabal that threatened Florence's republican spirit. He introduced legislation requiring greater transparency in banking relationships with the state, and he pushed for new limits on private lending to public officials. None of it passed. Then came the last and most dangerous move Giovanni proposed, restructuring the office of Gonfaloniere di Giustizia, Standard Bearer of Justice, the rotating executive magistrate who oversaw Florence's highest civic responsibilities. He suggested reducing the rotation period from 2 months to 1 and expanding oversight committees to include lower guild members. The reform appeared procedural. In reality, it was a trap. Shorter terms meant less stability, and more frequent elections allowed Medici-influenced guilds to stack the office with compliant faces. But what disturbed the elites most wasn't the proposal itself. It was how quickly it gained support. Within weeks, minor guilds began signing petitions in favor of the reform. Public markets displayed crude woodcuts of the fair city, upheld by humble artisans, while noblemen sat idle in the background. This was Medici populism at its most effective, indirect aesthetic and disarming. Some began to fear that Giovanni would, despite his advanced age and failing health, make one final bid for overt rule. A rumor circulated that he planned to have Cosimo appointed Gonfaloniere for life, a violation of Florence's proud republican traditions. No evidence supported this claim, but its impact was real. In elite circles, it stoked anxiety that the Medici weren't just consolidating power, they were preparing to end the Republic. The pressure on Giovanni intensified. One anonymous letter preserved in a state archive and likely authored by an Albizzi ally warned, "You will not enjoy the crown of the city. You will die holding its leash, but your son will find the collar snapped." Giovanni did not respond. Instead, he focused on finalizing his estate. He created a will with unusual clauses, a detailed apportionment of shares in the Medici bank directives for maintaining anonymous partnerships, and a clause forbidding his heirs from constructing new palaces for 20 years. He knew visibility bred resentment, and he intended for Cosimo to operate beneath that resentment until the system was secure. But the darkest insight into Giovanni's mindset came from a lesser-known instruction in the will that the family's personal physician, Maestro Francesco Bagnoni, be given a permanent stipend, but only if he agreed to destroy all medical records related to Giovanni's final months. The physician complied. No official documents survived detailing Giovanni's specific illness symptoms or treatment. All we know is that his decline was described as progressive and without agony, a vague phrase that could conceal almost anything. One odd detail survived only through the family steward's diary in the final days of his illness. Giovanni requested the windows of his chamber be boarded over and the walls covered in black cloth. The room, by all accounts, became a dark, suffocating space. A candle was permitted only for meals and prayer. Visitors were discouraged. One servant wrote he dies already in a tomb of his own choosing. Historians have puzzled over this. Was it fear of illness, a symbolic ritual, or perhaps a psychological breakdown under the weight of his own planning? Some believe it was a theatrical gesture of control. If Florence would not grant him kingship, he would orchestrate his own passing as a final act of sovereign will. But perhaps the most chilling testament to his mindset is this on the day he died. February 20th, 1429, Giovanni left an unsigned note folded beneath his pillow. It contained only a single sentence written in a firm but unadorned hand. A city ruled by many is ruled by none. Giovanni di Bicci's death on February 20th, 1429, was described in official accounts as peaceful, even serene. Yet, from the vantage of history, it was anything but. While his passing marked the end of an individual life, it activated a system that had been methodically prepared for years, a network of loyalties, debts, favors, and silence that transformed one man's absence into another man's ascendancy. In fact, the final weeks leading up to Giovanni's death revealed just how politically charged those moments truly were. Unpublished testimonies from household staff and secretaries paint a picture far more fraught than the polished Medici eulogies would later suggest. Giovanni was bedridden for nearly a month before his passing, but his illness was managed almost entirely within the home. No city physicians were summoned. No clerics were seen administering last rites until the final 24 hours. Instead, all medical care was entrusted to his longtime personal doctor, Maestro Bagnoni, who, as per Giovanni's instructions, worked in total seclusion. One steward recounting the tension later wrote, "It was as if the house had swallowed itself. No laughter, no trade, no wine. Only whispers." During this period, Giovanni dictated a series of confidential letters, none of which survive today, but which are referenced in later correspondences by allies and adversaries alike. What we do know is that these letters were hand-delivered to 5 locations: Rome, Venice, Naples, Milan, and Lucca. Each city contained either a Medici bank branch or a key political ally. The timing is significant. These letters were sent out within days of each other, and each recipient took a clear political position in the weeks following Giovanni's death, supporting Cosimo's ascent. If this was coincidence, it was uncanny. But more likely it was execution. Giovanni, aware that his death could trigger instability, seems to have used his final days not to seek peace, but to trigger contingency plans. Even the city's announcement of his death was stage-managed. Normally, a prominent Florentine's passing would be declared with a solemn bell toll from the Palazzo Vecchio. In Giovanni's case, the bell rang not once, but 3 times, with an unusual delay between each strike. Some chroniclers, including Bartolomeo Miniati, noted that this pattern had not been used in decades and may have carried a coded message. The delay, they speculated, represented the 3 pillars of Florence: the church, the guilds, and the popolo, pausing in acknowledgement of a 4th force, the bank. Immediately following the announcement, several administrative oddities occurred. Within hours, a full accounting of Medici debts to the city was produced unsolicited and delivered to the city treasurer. It revealed no outstanding liabilities. A second file detailed Medici donations to public works over the past 10 years. Both were meticulously indexed and signed by notaries who had not been publicly associated with the family. The message was unmistakable. The Medici were not merely mourners, they were prepared. The reaction from Florence's elite was unsurprisingly tepid. official condolences came slowly. The Albizzi faction issued a one-paragraph statement offering regret at the loss of a charitable Florentine. Others praised his work ethic and humility, but avoided any reference to political influence or public leadership. The absence of civic mourning ceremonies, which were common for major figures, was noted even by foreign envoys. One Venetian observer wrote Florence has lost a merchant, but it grieves as though it lost a stonecutter. But outside elite circles, the mood was different. Hundreds of artisans, market women, guild apprentices, and minor clergy gathered in impromptu processions near San Lorenzo, where the Medici crypt had been prepared. Though the family had not invited the public, they came anyway, bringing flowers, candles, and even handwritten prayers. These were not performances for political gain. They were spontaneous affirmations of loyalty. To the people, Giovanni had been more than a banker. He had been a stabilizer, a patron, a quiet redeemer of their civic dignity. One disturbing moment occurred the night before the funeral. According to a report filed by a city constable, a group of masked figures attempted to enter the Medici household under the pretense of paying last respects. When challenged, they produced forged tokens of guild membership and attempted to bribe the guards. A scuffle broke out, but the group dispersed before anyone could be identified. Theories abounded. Some suspected an assassination attempt aimed at Cosimo. Others believed it was a symbolic protest. Whatever the motive, it confirmed what the family already knew. Not everyone wanted a smooth succession. Inside the Medici residence, precautions were taken. Armed guards were discreetly positioned at each entrance. Servants were rotated to prevent routine poisoning. Cosimo himself was reported to have slept in a different chamber each night during the week following his father's death. One of his secretaries noted that he kept a dagger beneath his pillow, a detail omitted from official biographies, but preserved in private family journals. Meanwhile, the papal legate in Florence, perhaps tipped off by the earlier letters, issued a formal statement honoring Giovanni's service to the church. While innocuous on the surface, the statement included a line that raised eyebrows. The Holy See recognizes the continuance of good stewardship in the House of Medici. The wording was not merely polite, it was suggestive. The church had effectively acknowledged Cosimo's succession without waiting for any civic process. Then came the most delicate part, opening Giovanni's will. In the chamber where the will was read, only a handful of individuals were present: Cosimo Lorenzo, the family notary, and 2 witnesses chosen from the minor guilds. The document itself, long rumored to contain political landmines, was surprisingly brief. It confirmed Cosimo as the principal heir to both the bank and the family estate, instructed that charitable donations continue in Giovanni's name, and left symbolic items to trusted allies. But one line stood out: let the city remember who paid her debts. Cosimo made no public statement following the will's reading. Instead, he began a week-long period of official mourning, during which he met privately with guild leaders, judicial officers, and religious figures. These meetings were unrecorded, but by the end of the mourning period, something had changed. Those who had hesitated to acknowledge the Medici as Florence's central power now did so openly. Giovanni had not died quietly. He had died efficiently. If Giovanni di Bicci's death was a carefully arranged political event, then his funeral was the curtain call of a performance decades in the making. Every gesture, every silence, and every shadow in the public theater of Florence served a purpose to secure the Medici legacy and telegraph their unshakable grip on the city's future. What unfolded on the streets of Florence in late February 1429 was not merely a mourning ritual, it was a political pageant laced with symbolism, secrecy, and psychological control. The first sign that this would not be an ordinary funeral came with the location. Giovanni was laid to rest at the Church of San Lorenzo, a site still under construction, but one that would later become synonymous with Medici power. At the time, San Lorenzo was an unfinished project, raw stone open scaffolds, a sanctuary in progress. Choosing this space rather than a traditional family crypt or established cathedral sent a clear message: the Medici were building not just a legacy, but a new spiritual architecture for Florence itself. Cosimo personally oversaw the funeral preparations. He rejected the pomp typical of elite burials: no exotic tapestries, no foreign processions, no imported relics. Instead, the route from the Medici residence to San Lorenzo was lined with ordinary Florentine workers, blacksmiths, butchers, cobblers, and stonemasons, many of whom wore the same simple cloth bands given to them during Medici-sponsored civic festivals. The result was chillingly effective. Where other families showcased splendor, Cosimo staged humility armed with a subtle theatricality that left observers unsettled. The coffin itself was unadorned, made of dark cypress wood, covered only by a cloth bearing the Medici coat of arms in muted thread. But beneath the cloth, according to later testimonies from household servants, was a hidden compartment containing a sealed scroll. Its contents remain unknown, likely a symbolic gesture or part of the Medici's internal rituals. What is known, however, is that only Cosimo and the family notary handled the casket before it was closed. No priest was allowed to touch the body until just before burial. At the funeral mass, Cosimo arranged for the readings to diverge from standard texts. Instead of the usual psalms of consolation, the selected passages emphasized stewardship justice and the burden of leadership. One particularly haunting passage came from Ecclesiastes. There is a time to keep silence and a time to speak. The implication was clear. Giovanni had spoken through his works. Now it was Cosimo's time to act. After the service, the coffin was not lowered into the crypt immediately. Instead, it was placed on a raised stone platform in the church nave, surrounded by unlit candles and 4 silent guards. For 6 hours, it remained there untouched. This practice was not standard in Florentine custom. Some whispered that it was a ritual of protection. Others that it was a last defiant gesture aimed at Medici enemies. "We have nothing to hide. Do your worst." But the most psychologically disturbing moment came that night. Just after sundown, with the church closed to the public, a procession of 12 men, hand-selected by Cosimo, entered San Lorenzo with torches. They performed a silent vigil around the coffin, each man placing a coin at the base and pressing his palm against the lid. These men were not clergy. They were not family. They were agents, trusted members of the Medici network, chosen to symbolically seal the transfer of authority. A city scribe who witnessed part of the ritual later described the scene. It was not mourning. It was something older. It was something from before Rome. The air smelled not of incense, but of something bitter like burned parchment or dried myrrh. This peculiar staging had a dual purpose. For Cosimo's allies, it confirmed that the Medici machine had survived its founder. For enemies, it was a chilling reminder that the death of the patriarch did not mean disarray. There would be no infighting, no pause, only continuity. And that continuity was immediately put into action. The very next morning, an official notice was posted outside the Palazzo della Signoria, listing a series of public donations made on behalf of the late Giovanni di Bicci. The items included funding for orphanage renovations, hospital supplies, and grain subsidies. But more telling was the subtext. These gifts had already been pre-approved by the Signoria. No debate, no delay. Cosimo had secured the votes in advance. Over the following week, funeral ceremonies gave way to administrative changes. Several minor offices were filled with Medici-affiliated candidates. A new set of tax collectors drawn from the very guilds Giovanni had supported took up positions across the city. Even the court saw a shakeup. A longtime Medici critic was reassigned to a peripheral post in Arezzo. No reasons were given, no one protested. Yet behind the smooth transfer of power, darker currents stirred. Anonymous pamphlets began appearing near markets and guild halls. One depicted a man in rags holding puppet strings attached to a throne. Another showed a blindfolded monk weighing coins on a scale with the caption, "Which sin buys the soul of a city?" More alarming were the whispers of retaliation. In the weeks following the funeral, 3 separate plots to sabotage Medici grain shipments were uncovered. One included forged warehouse permits. Another involved tainted storage sacks laced with spoiled rye. Though no arrests were made, the operations bore signs of coordinated sabotage. Cosimo responded with calm but decisive action. He dispatched letters to Medici branches across Italy, reminding them to double security, reassess lending terms, and flag any irregularities from clients with recent ties to the Albizzi or Strozzi factions. Internally, he began shifting loyal accountants into sensitive posts. Externally, he remained affable, hosting small dinners and funding local religious plays. Yet behind that affability was steel. The Medici had survived the death of their founder, not by luck, but by meticulous control over perception information and ritual. The funeral had served as a firewall distilling emotion into awe, grief into authority. And so, with Giovanni laid beneath the stone floors of a church, still echoing with whispered chants, Florence awoke to a new reality, a world in which death was no longer an interruption of power, but one of its most terrifying instruments. Cosimo de Medici's rapid consolidation of power following his father's death was no accident. It was the culmination of a system that had been set in motion long before Giovanni breathed his last. In fact, as Florence mourned, the true genius of Giovanni's political legacy revealed itself not in monuments or grand declarations, but in the sudden, near-seamless orchestration of a posthumous coup. What emerged was not just succession, it was activation. Within days of the funeral, Cosimo began implementing what scholars now describe as a pre-engineered framework of governance. This system did not rely on official titles. Instead, it depended on the placement of reliable individuals in key leverage points, minor court offices, tax collection posts, even grain distribution warehouses. Each node was part of a broader Medici matrix of soft power bound together, not by legal mandate but by obligation fear and carefully cultivated loyalty. The extent of this planning was revealed in the meticulous records discovered in the Medici family archive, a cache of documents known today as the Libro Nero, or Black Book. Though it would not surface until centuries later, the Libro Nero cataloged an astonishing array of connections, lists of names, coded by trust-level annotated ledgers of loan-for-favor arrangements, and summaries of key votes in the Signoria cross-referenced with private payments. These weren't just financial records, they were operational blueprints for political capture. The shift became visible in 1429's spring elections. Although Cosimo held no official position, the roster of successful candidates to the Signoria included 5 known Medici affiliates. 2 of them had never held public office before. Their sudden elevation raised eyebrows, but no formal complaints were filed. Florence's ruling class had been disarmed not by violence but by disorientation. Even more telling was the silence of the Albizzi. Rinaldo degli Albizzi, once Giovanni's chief rival, found himself isolated. His proposals were routinely voted down, and former allies began to distance themselves. In one private letter to a friend in Siena, Rinaldo wrote with bitterness, "I speak to ghosts. Their mouths say Florence, but their hands bear the mark of the banker." Rumors circulated that the Albizzi were preparing a countermove. A secret gathering was said to have taken place at a country villa outside the city, with members of the Strozzi, Peruzzi, and Ridolfi families present. The topic: how to restore Republican equilibrium. No concrete action followed, but not long after, one of the attendees, an elderly banker named Matteo Ridolfi, was found dead in his study, having apparently collapsed over a cup of wine. No investigation was opened. His family waived the right to autopsy. This would not be the last suspicious death. By late 1429, a rash of unexplained illnesses swept through Florence's upper class. A prominent judge collapsed during a civic ceremony. A wool guild leader suddenly took leave, citing nervous strain, and never returned. While disease was common, the pattern and timing led some to suspect foul play. The city's apothecaries noted an uptick in purchases of mandragora and hellebore plants, commonly used in medicinal doses but also in poisons. Whether these were used against the Medici or by them is still debated. But the message was clear: the age of benign banking was over. Cosimo, meanwhile, continued to maintain a posture of calm engagement. He increased his public philanthropy, commissioning new chapels and promising funds for the continued construction of San Lorenzo. He hosted foreign envoys with the grace of a seasoned diplomat, careful never to overstep protocol. But beneath this cultivated gentleness, Florence was being rewired. One of the most chilling examples of this was the so-called Council of Recovery, a temporary committee created to evaluate civic expenditures. On paper, it was a harmless financial audit. In practice, it served as a vehicle for Medici-aligned bureaucrats to question, suspend, or redirect payments to any rival-controlled institution. Records were lost, salaries were delayed, public works stalled. Within months, 3 major projects backed by the Albizzi were effectively bankrupt. Perhaps most psychologically devastating was the subtle campaign to erode the memory of Medici opponents. Rinaldo degli Albizzi's portraits were removed from public buildings under the pretense of renovation. Street names honoring anti-Medici guild leaders were altered. A local theater changed its spring program from a classical tragedy sponsored by the Strozzi to a religious morality play dedicated to a virtuous citizen of humble means, widely interpreted as a tribute to Giovanni. The speed of this transformation was disorienting. What made it so effective wasn't terror, but ambiguity. Nothing was ever declared. No proclamations of rule, no banning of rival factions. Instead, there was simply a reordering of who mattered. A man who had once held 3 guild titles now found himself waiting 2 weeks for a city permit. A merchant with Albizzi connections suddenly discovered new tariffs on his imports. Slowly, the cost of descent rose, not because it was punished, but because it was no longer profitable. Even the church participated in this quiet recalibration. The Archbishop of Florence, a figure once cool toward the Medici, issued a sermon in late 1429 declaring a city thrives, not by its arguments, but by its peace. And peace has found a patron. The message was subtle but unmistakable. By the year's end, Cosimo had no official title, no office, and no seat in the Signoria. And yet foreign ambassadors addressed him as the Signore. Street vendors asked his blessing before relocating. Artists delivered sketches without commission, hoping to gain favor. One priest remarked, "There are laws in Florence, but there's only one judgment." And all of it stemmed from the mechanisms Giovanni had designed a regime that did not declare itself, but revealed itself through function. It was not a coup. It was inheritance not of blood, but of structure. What had begun as a merchant family's strategy to survive oligarchic exclusion had become something Florence had never seen before. A republic governed not by majority, but by monopoly, quiet, stable, and terrifying in its precision. Giovanni di Bicci had always believed that power should never announce itself. But in the months after his death, Florence bore witness to the consequences of that belief, in the form of whispers, accidents, and subtle threats, all carefully wrapped in the velvet glove of institutional procedure. His legacy, far from fading into noble remembrance, became the operating logic of an invisible regime. And as 1430 dawned, that regime began to encounter its first wave of violent resistance. To understand what came next, one must examine the psyche of Florence's disenfranchised elite. The Albizzi, the Strozzi, and their extended network of patricians had lost something more precious than money, or votes. They had lost centrality. A generation raised on the assumption of inherited leadership now found itself excluded not by swords or legislation, but by account books and whispered debts. The mechanisms of governance had not changed, only the hands operating them. Resentment curdled into action. Small plots emerged, most of them poorly organized and quickly neutralized. A stash of pikes and helmets was discovered in a wine merchant's cellar. A courier carrying letters between disgruntled guild leaders and a captain in Lucca was arrested and disappeared without trial. A baker reportedly once employed by the Pazzi was caught attempting to deliver bread laced with a lethal dose of aconitum, a toxin that kills slowly and imitates illness. The bread was intended for a banquet at which Cosimo was expected. He canceled last minute. The baker's fate was never made public, but not all resistance came in the form of clumsy conspiracies. Some factions pursued institutional subversion. A coalition of anti-Medici families drafted a proposal for civic restoration, aimed at limiting the influence of banking houses in the Republic by restricting credit operations with foreign entities. On the surface, it was a fiscal measure. In reality, it was a direct attack on the Medici's international reach. The measure gained traction within several guild councils until mysteriously, 3 members reversed their votes after unrelated audits exposed irregularities in their tax filings. The proposal died quietly. Even more ominous were the signs of infiltration within the church. A young Dominican friar, Fra Benedetto, began preaching openly against the consolidation of wealth in Florence. His sermons targeted no one by name but were laced with unmistakable references. He who trades in indulgences shall find no indulgence at the gates of heaven. Crowds grew, so did concern. Within a month, Fra Benedetto was transferred to a rural monastery near Volterra. Within 6, he was dead. Officially, the cause was pneumonia, but among the brothers of his order there were whispers of foul play of tinctures added to his wine of dreams, disturbed by fever of confessions made in delirium. While the Medici never acknowledged any role in these events, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Across Florence, resistance became increasingly symbolic. Graffiti began to appear on city walls, a blindfolded merchant, a scale tipped by coins, a snake coiled around a book. Satirical plays circulated through taverns, some portraying a banker's soul being weighed and found wanting by St. Peter. These were not acts of open rebellion, but of emotional protest, a society wrestling with the knowledge that it had changed and could not change back. Cosimo understood this tension. In response, he launched a counteroffensive of narrative control. He commissioned paintings not of his family, but of Florence herself, idealized serene industrious. Civic pride became a proxy for Medici loyalty. Historians and poets were paid to recount the city's recovery from past wars, subtly attributing its strength to the wisdom of prudent citizens. Cosimo funded public lectures at the University of Florence, inviting humanist scholars to speak on the virtues of harmony, order, and moderation, all things the Medici now claimed to embody. Perhaps the most disturbing tactic, however, involved the repurposing of Medici charity. Giovanni had always believed in supporting the poor, but now these donations were restructured. Aid was distributed through new offices managed by Medici clerks. Applicants were quietly asked about family ties, political sympathies, even voting histories. Bread and loans were given generously but always remembered. A refusal could mean bureaucratic limbo or a visit from a notary with inconvenient questions. Poverty, once a social condition, became a political credential. By late 1430, even foreign powers began treating Cosimo as the de facto head of state. Letters from Milan, Venice, and the papal court were addressed directly to him, bypassing the Signoria. Ambassadors requested meetings at the Medici Palace rather than the Palazzo Vecchio. Cosimo declined the title of ruler again and again, but his authority was now institutionalized, even internationally recognized. That year also saw the first signs of long-term consolidation. New family alliances were formed through carefully arranged marriages. Medici daughters were matched with minor noble houses in Siena and Ferrara. Cousins were placed in distant posts as bank managers, city officials, and papal advisors. This was not nepotism, it was entrenchment. Still, nothing cemented the new order more than the psychological shift among the citizenry. Fear had become functional. Silence had become wisdom. The Medici were no longer merely bankers, they were inevitability. The final symbolic blow to the old order came in the spring of 1431, when a statue was quietly erected near the entrance of San Lorenzo. It was not of Giovanni nor of Cosimo, but of an allegorical figure, a bearded man in merchant's robes, holding a scroll in one hand and balancing a set of scales in the other. Beneath him the inscription read, "He served without title. He ruled without oath. He left without permission." Florentines passed it daily, no one defaced it, no one praised it, but everyone understood it. In the end, the death of Giovanni di Bicci had not created a void. It had created a system, one where power lived in contracts, ritual memory, and silence. And once Florence adapted to that system, it could no longer imagine any other. The story of Giovanni di Bicci is not the tale of a typical ruler because he was never officially one. He left behind no throne, no royal edicts, no battlefield victories, and yet his legacy transformed Florence more profoundly than many crowned heads ever could. What Giovanni perfected was a new architecture of power, one that required no banners or declarations. Instead, it lived in ledgers, tax reforms, silent alliances, and rituals that blurred the line between mourning and messaging. His death was not an endpoint, but a handoff, the triggering event of a system designed to survive him. In entrusting Cosimo with both strategy and restraint, Giovanni ensured that his family would become inseparable from Florence's own civic identity. The Republic endured in name, but its soul, its machinery had shifted irreversibly into private hands. Not through coercion, but through dependence. Not through fear, but through inevitability. In the decades that followed, the Medici would rise further, Cosimo becoming Pater Patriae, Lorenzo the Magnificent, shaping the Italian Renaissance, and future popes and dukes emerging from the family line. But all of them operated within a blueprint Giovanni had drafted, one where banking governance and cultural patronage formed a single, seamless organism. And Florence, it flourished, but not freely. It became the model of controlled republics, a paradoxical symbol of liberty, ruled by quiet design. Giovanni's greatest accomplishment in the end may have been psychological. He taught a city that power need not be visible to be absolute. That silence, well orchestrated, could echo louder than any decree. Even now, centuries later, the ghost of that lesson lingers in corporate boardrooms and silent financiers, behind governments and the machinery of influence that moves without face or form. Because Giovanni di Bicci did not just die, he engineered his absence.